see it more as a limitation. Like the government can't make a law that stops people being able to vote. So it's not a right or a duty. It's they cannot remove people's like they can't make certain laws. It's limiting their power. The Constitution's limiting their ability to make a law that says you can't vote, women can't vote, men can't vote, people in jail can't vote, whatever. I see it more as that. Does that make sense?
If I understood you correctly, your point seems to be that voting without attaching right or duty to it, the act of voting on the part of the citizen is a restriction on the government.
Not on the part of the citizen, just simply, you know how the Constitution says the government can do this and can't do this? That's basically the purpose. It's just saying
that's not basically the purpose, but one of the purposes.
Yeah, it's saying you can't limit the voting franchise base.
If the just a moment, if the government can't limit the franchise, say the government of Australia enacts a law, the Parliament of Australia enacts a law saying well, you have to have a master's degree in any discipline at least to be able to vote, an educational requirement, or you have to own a property requirement, you name it, you know, or people of a certain sexual orientation are not allowed to vote. If you say government can't do that, government's inability to do that has to be vested in something.
Yeah, I would say based on the democratic ideals.
Yes.
Undemocratic, so it would be struck down.
This is where we disagree. If you say, like for example, take Australian Communist Party's case, great case. The majority judgment in that case says that the power to dissolve a corporate body like the Australian Communist Party is vested with the state legislatures. They never said it's not vested at all. They said it's vested with the state legislatures, and that power can be exercised by the Australian Parliament only in times of war. And well, we don't think it's times of war, so out goes the law. So the power is there. The question is who can exercise that power. On the other hand, your argument seems to be, well, you just can't do that at all. Well, if you just can't do that at all, then it has to be in the nature of a right.
You know how Section 51 gives powers to certain people? I would say that given that we've found the right to vote, maybe I don't consider it a right, but the right to vote has been found implied in the democratic whatever structure. The federal government doesn't have that power to legislate in that area. That's what I'm trying to say. Like,
So again, it's a
rest with the
powers
same
argument.
maybe,
Okay.
if it was decided.
If the government doesn't, then how do you explain the Australian Parliament's law, which basically can put you in prison if you don't vote?
They can make you vote. They just can't not let you vote. That's the way I see it.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, that's the argument that has currency in Australian constitutional law, but not accepted outside. But then it doesn't have to be accepted outside, so long as it makes sense in that nation.
Sense in my head.
It's logical, but life of law is not logic, as Holmes said. Yes.
I have personal opinion that maybe I hope that mostly my friends will be agree with me that still like despite having not having Bill of Rights or like is you said that what you said the guy right to vote or duty to vote, the system in Australia working well.
Mm-hmm. System was working in Nazi Germany also very well until it didn't.
But like, if you
I'm not saying Australia is Nazi. Please don't. Yeah.
Like the voting system, like particularly, it's a lot better than here.
Oh, yes, that's true. I mean, the absence of or the low voter turnout is lamented upon in India a lot. In USA, it is lamented upon. The question here is not the politics of it, though, because we're talking about constitutional law, so we're talking about rights. And what I'm saying is, if everybody agrees, like for example, her argument, it's logical, it's sound, it makes sense. Well, I don't agree with it, but it makes sense. Because I'm on the other side because of the differences in our structures. But if you say that in a democratic system, well, democracy will work only if people are allowed to vote. Democracy never said that everybody should be allowed to vote. That the age of franchise was 21. Why was it reduced to 18? Why was it 21 in the first place? Anybody knows that? Why was the age of voting as is 21? Because 21 was the age in Sparta where you were physically able to wear the armor. That's the reason behind it. The armor was so heavy, as shown in the movie 300. When you had to be 21 years old to be able to carry that, the shield, the armor, the spear with you. So that's where the age of 21 comes from. And the age of 18 also comes from a war. Remember the slogan, old enough to die, old enough to vote. The slogan given in USA, 18 was the age of the draft during the Vietnam War. So old enough to die, old enough to vote. Right? Why can't people who are 16 years old allowed to vote? Think about it. 18 is an arbitrary age. If you think about it, when I was in high school, say, well, I won't tell you the year, but when I was in high school, there was no such thing as internet. There was dial-up internet. Most of you don't even know what dial-up internet looks like unless you've seen the movie Matrix, where the strange sound comes along. Your phone would stop working, and nobody ever imagined that you could chat video on phone one day. There was no concept of a phone like this, right? People who are growing up in that age where there is much more exposure to information, the maturity of the mind that a person of 16 years of age has today probably is enough to decide who they want to vote, but they're not allowed to vote. Democracy never said everybody's allowed to vote. Democracy only says you can vote to elect your representatives. But then that can be regulated by the government. So you take that logic, and what she said it fits into that mode of analysis. But if you say, well, I am a citizen of a free republic, democracy and republicanism are not the same ideas. India is a republic. It's a democratic republic. Australia is not completely a republic, is it? Like the UK, it's a constitutional monarchy. It's not a republic. You talk about republic, remember what Niccolo Machiavelli said in the first book on discourses. He says, I'm paraphrasing, a republic includes elements of aristocracy, of oligopoly, and of democracy. So sometimes you have to have power completely in one hand. Imagine a situation of emergency where all the power is vested into one hand. System of oligopoly, think about the civil services, for example. A few people selected by a competitive exam are then sitting and governing pretty much the entire nation. The judiciary, that's an oligopoly. Right? A few people get to decide who nobody voted for, nobody can remove. And then there is the general power of the government. A republic has tranches of all these three elements. Democracy is but one of them. And a republic is based on the idea of a free individual. So you come from that angle, and suddenly what she said becomes completely incorrect. Government can't force me to exercise my right, because if they can, then a confession obtained by force is also admissible. And no self-respecting lawyer in Australia would accept that proposition. That's where the cognitive dissonance starts. Right? I think you had your hand up. So, okay. Yes.
Because you kind of argue it on like a social contract theory that if you have a right, you usually have a corresponding duty. So if you have a right to democracy, then you have a duty to vote.
No.
No?
I don't agree with that. But I'm interested. I'll explain. But I'm interested in what's your logic.
Well, I think that like the theory behind it is whenever you have a right for a citizen, you also have a duty that corresponds with that. So if you have right to democracy, then you have a duty to vote. So you don't have the option not to vote.
Well, if I have a duty to vote, then I certainly have the duty to show up at the election booth and then say, I am completely pissed off at this entire system. I don't want to vote for anyone. Well, if I have a right, then government's responsibility is to facilitate the exercise of that right. What you are doing is, I'm basically arguing in the Lockean tradition. You are using Mr. What was his name? The philosopher who legitimized the crown after the revolution in England, Hobbes. Your argument is Hobbesian. In that argument, it makes complete sense. but I'm not a Hobbesian.
You're locked in.
I would like to think so, but
So in Australia, you can submit an empty ballot. Like you don't have to.
that doesn't count for anything. You can do that in India too, but that doesn't
Does it
count for
count
anything.
to say none of the above?
Yes, it does. None of the above are reported. See,
So empty ballots are all counted.
empty ballots are like they don't exist at all.
Yeah, they're incorrectly submitted.
Yeah.
But they're a statistic. You can see how many people just threw away their vote.
But I guess
Well, so I could have voted accidentally, incorrectly as well.
Yeah, but you should probably be educated.
Most of the right of especially the right of political speech is symbolic. Why is burning the flag in America acceptable? Because it is a symbol. Nobody will burn the flag in their right mind. It's a symbol that shows who what they are. Right? Can you burn the flag? You can't burn the flag in India. At one point of time, we couldn't even fly the flag in India. The chancellor of this university had to fight a legal battle, and you see the flag right there. So flying the flag is a symbol. Burning that flag is also a symbol. Political speech, most of it is simply symbolic. Right? Why is it so important for like say let me give you a personal example. I go, and I'll take your question in just a minute. I went for my master's to Columbia, and there was a big event, all colleagues and friends from 50 different nations assemble, and I'm going there, and about 13 people, students from India, they were all wearing a little flag on the lapel of their suit. I was not wearing that flag. I had no concept that I could purchase a little thing and put it on my lapel of the jacket. But when I saw almost everyone wearing that flag, the act of wearing that flag became a symbol. So I went and borrowed one from somebody and put it on. Most of the speech that we engage in is symbolic. When you tell your brother or your friend, go whatever yourself, you don't mean it. It's a symbol. It's supposed to express an idea. So the ability of not being able to vote for anyone, the ability to be able to express dissent and to know that that dissent counts somewhere is a symbol of a democratic nation, a nation that is free. Right? But as constitutional lawyers, we have to be able to base these rights into something concrete. That something concrete is almost inevitably a Bill of Rights, which is absent. I have to take his question first.
So you talked about the flag case.
Yes.
And you said burning the flag is a symbol as well. Is that accepted in India now?
No.
Why
won't
do
be.
they draw that distinction between?
It won't be accepted because the people don't think that's an acceptable mode of expressing your dissent.
But didn't you say that India has a complete freedom?
India doesn't have, so Article 19(1)(a), Fundamental Right of Freedom to Speech and Expression, has a corresponding reasonable restrictions clause, Article 19(2), which allows the government, parliament or the government to impose reasonable restrictions on the exercise of that right. However, that reasonable restrictions clause is subject to a rich jurisprudence where essentially what happens is if the government wishes to restrict the right, A, it has to be on one of the grounds mentioned in Article 19(2). B, it cannot be excessive or restrictive, unduly restrictive.
What was that clause of?
19(2), Article 19, Sub-Article 2.
I think in India you can't even wear a flag, but in Australia people can wear their.
Oh, you can do that. Nobody will. There is a law, but nobody enforces that law. You have to observe you have to give the flag its due. Those laws are there in USA also. You can't. You have to host the flag in a certain way.
Oh.
Those laws are there.
Until they are from minority.
Well, I won't comment on that. I won't comment on that. That's a political question. I don't want to. Yes.
And I was going to say, has it been considered in India if there's a majority of voters that voted no vote, basically, what would be the outcome? Is it just a re-election?
There is a principle of law in election law that has been pressed that there has to be a right of recall. That if sufficiently large majority of people are dissatisfied with the services of their MP or their MLA in the state, then the right of recall has to be granted. The proposal has not gained much support in political circles. Second, the proposition was put forward, what happens if NOTA gets the most number of votes? Well, are you going to hold re-elections? Well, in that situation, it was suggested that you can't hold re-elections because it's a huge drain on the public purse. So in that event, it will be noted that in this particular constituency, people were dissatisfied completely, and the second candidate who got the most votes would be elected. That was the proposal that was made. As it happens, luckily, a need to have a concrete law so far has not arisen because NOTA as a voting option has not been exercised by sufficiently large number of people. So again, it becomes a symbolic act of dissent which hasn't had any practical application on election law.
It seems like if it hasn't even been thought through what the implication of that box of none of the above would be, then I guess its impact is quite minimal.
Impact is minimal, but since when was the impact of a right a contingency to let that right be
It seems
exercised?
like a bit of an empty right.
Well, in that way, all rights are empty.
But like,
The idea of a right, if I may, is not that I do this, I exercise this right, and this benefit comes to society. The idea of a right is, if this society is to exist, I have to be allowed to exercise my right. What benefit is going to come out of me being allowed to dress the way that I can? It's just me expressing myself. But the point is the society that we wish to live in the kind of society that says, well, here is a bunch of rights that you can exercise only if there is a given benefit to the community? That's not much different from Soviet Russia. That's the beginning of communism. The idea of a right is, well, we believe in every individual being allowed to do whatever they want, so long as it's within the limits of reason.
Can you please give us an example? Like, you're talking about very extreme cases in Australian law where, like, exercising a right, as you would call it, not to vote, has ended up with someone ending up in jail. In my experience, it's been very easy to find a way not to vote. You can just basically say, I have a strong enough belief that I don't want to, I have a deep religious conviction that I don't want to, I'm out of the country, is a good enough reason not to vote. And I'm wondering if there's an example of a particular circumstance where the Australian government has actually viciously enforced
The right to vote?
no, the obligation to vote.
My research discloses these two incidents that I mentioned, the Melissa Manson's incident and the other one, 1992. I'm not aware of any other incidents apart from these two.
Okay, so
What's your question?
I'm sort of asking whether, I kind of agree with you in theory, but I don't know whether it works in practice.
What, the non-enforcement of right to vote doesn't work in practice?
Yeah. Like, I think in practice there are a lot of ways around what you're arguing.
Look, I don't think that the legitimacy of any Australian government is going to be suspect if the right to compulsory voting is taken away. But that's not for me to decide, that's for the people of Australia to decide. As a case study in comparative constitutional law, I take the example. I have no political leanings on this one way or the other. I mean, let them all vote, let nobody vote, I don't care. But at a certain point of time, a conviction comes into play, where I say, well, if I don't want to vote, then just let me be. As Honorable Michael Kirby, he says that it's good if everybody votes. I'm paraphrasing what he said to me. Then nobody can say we did not elect this government. If I don't want to elect any government at all, how is it acceptable in a free nation for me to be forced to do something that I'm not willing to do? I don't believe the legitimacy of any government is ever going to be questioned. If 60% people vote or 95% of people vote. People vote in this big democracy 65, 70% at most. People in USA vote 55% and on average 60%. Nobody has ever argued that the legitimacy of the government is questioned. When George W. Bush lost the election, which we now know, the legitimacy of his government was not under question. So it's not about legitimacy of the government anymore. We're living in 2018. We're not fighting the Nazis or the communists. We're living in 2018. We're living in the age of rights. And if we say we are a free nation, a nation of rule of law, not a republic in its strict sense, but yet a nation that believes in individual freedom and individual dignity, then how is it possible in a nation which says a coerced confession is inadmissible in a criminal trial, but yet would force a person to go to vote? It's the symbolic value of the thing. Practically speaking, I don't think it will make any difference to Australian people. I rather personally believe that the habit of voting that has been inculcated will result in a marginal decline only. Take, for example, the ACTV case. The 90% law that all 90% of the free airtime has to be given to the incumbent. There is a very interesting study published in a peer-reviewed journal, Supreme Court Review in US, which establishes for a fact that before this law was enacted, approximately 94.7% of the airwaves were purchased by the 4 political parties that were incumbent. If anything, the law benefited the people who were otherwise incapable of purchasing airtime, which is extremely expensive. Now, all this empirical analysis was nice and dandy, but it still doesn't detract from the point that they're talking about rights. Governmental decision making is empirical. Constitutional decision making has to flow from rights. My argument, however, is that notwithstanding the empirical evidence, the method in which the Supreme Court decides the High Court decides the case is not a sustainable model. It won't work in the long run. But as far as the practical aspect of it is concerned, I don't think it will make any difference at all. But I also say that cannot be the reason which rights will then be allowed to be practiced or not. Take, for example, right of religion. What if we have only one Sikh person, or one Hindu, or one Parsi, or one Muslim? Are we going to deny the constitutional protections of the right to religion to this one person only because he's one? We can, but remember, that's exactly what Hitler did. Hitler said about Poland, what could sovereignty mean to a nation of a few 100,000? Think about that. Right. Any more questions? I think we're running out of time now. We have 5 minutes left.
We are expecting, like, from you that there's some information about emergency or
I can give you information. What?
that we are,
Please go on.
that you will be telling us about some
About emergency powers,
yeah, emergency.
I can do that. You were saying?
Just quickly, so you don't believe in the rights argument, but you said the duty argument. Is that something that you feel should have been taken in the ACTV case? So the duty on the government to...
I believe the ACTV case could have been decided in the same manner without creating an implied right of political speech.
So how do you feel about doing that?
Right. I'll have to, so now I can either talk about that or I can talk about emergency, so because of the, right, so. But if you look at the rights, sorry, the legislative competence jurisprudence in Australia, you'll see how the methodology used in the Communist Party's case could have just as easily have been used there, but it wasn't. For reasons that I can't explain, the court just bought into the idea of political speech being so sacrosanct and any restriction on that being suspect. That's an American position, but remember, America is a republic. Right? So, emergency pass. Okay, so quickly now, under the Indian Constitution, how much time do we have left, by the way? So I should know that first.
2 minutes.
So it's okay if we go 10 minutes above board? Okay. Indian Constitution provides for 3 kinds of emergencies that can be formally proclaimed. Article 352 talks about what I call external emergency. Emergency under Article 352 can be proclaimed in event of war, external aggression, or armed rebellion. Article 356 talks about proclamation of emergency. I can repeat that. You can ask me, I can repeat that.
No, just the, what is Article?
Three grounds, Article 352, three grounds. The President can proclaim emergency in the event of a war, external aggression, armed rebellion. Article 356 allows the President to proclaim an emergency in a state in the event of breakdown of constitutional machinery. Article 360, Article 360 allows the President to proclaim an emergency in case the credit of India or the financial stability of India or any part thereof is threatened. So economic emergency. There are consequences that follow proclamations of emergency. And there is specific procedures that are there to regulate this right. The most common consequence of a formal proclamation of emergency is that India ceases to be a federal nation. It becomes a tightly knit unitary nation. For example, in case of Article 352, external emergency, legislative powers of the state legislatures can be vested in the parliament to the extent they are required, or completely if they are required. The union government literally takes over control of the entire nation. In the case of internal emergency or president's rule under Article 356, all the legislative powers of the state legislature are vested in the parliament or in any other body that the president may by proclamation declare. The executive powers of the state cabinet are also exercised by the union cabinet or by any other body that the parliament, that the president may by proclamation prescribe. In the case of economic emergency, all the money bills that can be passed by the state are then reserved for the union parliament. So limited, only to the extent of spending of public money. What's the procedure? Broadly speaking, the procedure is something like this. The president makes a formal proclamation upon the advice of the cabinet. In case of Article 352, the satisfaction of the cabinet has to be communicated to the president in writing. Once the president makes that proclamation, it is immediately to be published. The proclamation stays in force for 2 months, within which it has to be, in the case of Article 356, it's 1 month, it has to be ratified by the parliament by a resolution. If the parliament refuses to pass a resolution approving the same, the emergency ends. Once the parliament approves the emergency, in case of Article 352, it stays in power for stays in force for 6 months. If a fresh proclamation is needed, the procedure has to be repeated. But there is no upper limit as such. In case of president's rule, there is an upper limit of 5 subsequent reproclamations of the same proclamation, after which fresh elections have to be called. In case of economic emergency, there is no upper limit as such. There can be as many proclamations as the president wants. Article 352 has been proclaimed 3 times in India so far. During the first Indo-Pak War, then the Sino-Indian War in 1962, and then the War of Independence of Bangladesh in 71. In Kargil War, the fourth Indo-Pak War, proclamation of emergency was not made by the president. The most abused of emergency provisions was Article 356, which was basically used by successive Congress governments, namely Indira Gandhi government, to suspend any state government that would be elected by the people of the state that was not in tune with their own philosophy. So a non-Congress party government elected, she would suspend it by proclaiming emergency. The provision was abused so drastically that the Supreme Court in early 90s, had to step in, and the Supreme Court had to say proclamations of emergency under Article 356 can be reviewed by the Supreme Court, and many proclamations were reviewed and declared invalid. What happens when a proclamation of emergency under 356 is declared invalid? The state legislature, which was suspended, is revived. And the government then continues to serve so long as it enjoys the confidence of the House for the remainder of its term. After that, fresh elections are called. Right? So Article 360 has never been invoked. The closest we came was the 1989 balance of payment crisis, but that was resolved without any need for economic emergency. So that's broadly the framework. One article that I haven't brought to your attention is Article 355. Article 355 is almost a verbatim reproduction, not a verbatim reproduction of the guarantee clause of the US Constitution. That's Article 4, Section 4, if I recall correctly. Article 355 says that it is the duty of the union government to protect the states against external aggression, internal disturbance, and breakdown of constitutional machinery. It has never been invoked in the history of this nation, but I believe it could be. Some of you might have heard about the infamous Armed Forces Special Powers Act. There is a law in India, AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act. It's applicable in the Northeast, in Jammu and Kashmir. It was applicable in Punjab during the times of terrorism. Armed Forces Special Powers Act is a very small 13 sections legislation, just 2 pages. And it effectively authorizes any member of the armed forces of the Indian Army to conduct any kind of search and surveillance operation, to essentially shoot to kill, to take into custody anybody, and so on and so forth. Grave, drastic powers. I have argued recently that Armed Forces Special Powers Act is unconstitutional because it authorizes a de facto proclamation of martial law. And martial law can't be proclaimed under a parliamentary legislation which has not been enacted drawing competence from Article 355. For example, AFSPA has been enacted by the Parliament and its constitutionality has been upheld by the Supreme Court by relying on a legislative entry, much like Section 51 in the Union list, which talks about, so Union Parliament can make laws on 97 subjects. One of those in entry 2A is deployment of armed forces. And by reference to that, the law was upheld. I have argued recently that this is all completely incorrect. Martial law in India can't be proclaimed. It can be proclaimed only if it is required to protect breakdown of constitutional machinery, which is a power granted in Article 355, not in entry 2A of the Union list and Schedule 7. A little bit more that you might be interested in is that during the drafting of the chapter on emergency provisions, this was draft Article 275, which became Article 352. Abundant references were made to Article 48 of the infamous Weimar Constitution, which was abused by by Hitler and Nazis to first grab power and then stay in power. It was specifically argued by many prominent members of the Constituent Assembly, many of them were prominent constitutional lawyers of their day and age, that we should have a provision where proclamation of emergency and continued operation of that proclamation are not vested in the hands of the same authority. So therefore, the system of parliamentary review came in, that meanwhile, the president must be given the powers to proclaim emergency because he is the only person who has information to secret intelligence reports and such. But once proclaimed, Parliament has to review and Parliament has to approve. If the Parliament doesn't, then it has to end right then and there. Fundamental rights are not suspended during the proclamation of emergency, which is to say, some fundamental rights are not suspended. For example, Article 21 cannot be suspended during the proclamation of any kind of emergency. What can be suspended is proceedings for enforcements of, so if there is any proceeding for enforcement of a fundamental right which is going on, that proceeding can be suspended, but for that you need a separate proclamation. So you need two proclamations essentially, one declaring emergency, the other one suspending these proceedings. Article 19 is automatically suspended in the event of a proclamation of emergency made in case of war or under Article 352. So those are the reference to Hitler is quite writ large during Constituent Assembly debates when these articles were being drafted. What they refused or rather didn't refer to was the leading theorist Carl Schmitt, who was incorrectly, I believe, said to be the theorist of Nazi state. He was not a theorist of the Nazi state. He was a theorist who was creating a state to protect Germans from constitution and ends up creating a monster in the Nazi state. Well, relying on Carl Schmitt and other people who have worked on Schmitt, I have argued that in the event of Article 355, the government of India can take all those actions which are not as grave as might be necessary in the case of an emergency. That is, for example, deployment of the Indian Army to be used against Indian citizens without parliamentary authorization. That can be done only in Article 352. But outside of that, we need a complete comprehensive legislation on the lines of, say, the Posse Comitatus Act or the Insurrection Act in the US that exactly demarcates what the army can and cannot do. And ad hoc legislations like AFSPA are unconstitutional because of the lack of legislative competence, and on the policy grounds because they are unworkable, because you don't know where the power of the army begins and where the power of the army ends. So if you have any specific questions about emergency, I'll be happy to answer. But the structure is mostly in the favor of executive branch.
You said you mentioned Indira Gandhi. Am I right in saying did she declare an emergency in the situation in 1984? Was that
75.
was it?
75.
No, the Golden Temple with the soldiers. Was
That time, no, emergency was not declared. Emergency was declared under Article 356, only applicable to the state of Punjab, not a national emergency. Luckily, I mean, or rather strangely, army was called in at the last resort when they couldn't do anything. Most of it was repressed or controlled by standard ordinary law enforcement. Any other questions that you might have about emergency powers? So on a concluding note the Bommai case that I spoke about, which makes presidential proclamations of emergency subject to review, limited but yet subject to judicial review with respect to relevancy, if not adequacy of the materials that the president reviewed in order to proclaim emergency. Right, I hope this was useful. Yes, please.
How does that work in relation to the economic provision? Because wouldn't you have to assess the adequacy with respect to the economic material?
That's a good question.
Or else you'd just be like, we're in a recession.
Bommai's judgment is restricted to Article 356.
356.
Because so long, I mean, no proclamation of economic emergency has yet been made. So the question of its review is quite moot. I mean, the only judgment available on the point is Bommai's case. There is a provision in Article 360 which says that salaries of judges can be reduced during an economic emergency. There is another article in the Constitution outside the chapter on emergency powers that says that the salaries of judges can't be reduced to their detriment. Their salaries and their allowances can't be reduced to their detriment during the tenure of office that they hold. I believe there are similar provisions in the Australian Constitution also, judicial independence and all. I have argued that the only possible justiciable question that might arise out of Article 360 in the context of an economic emergency is when the salaries of the judges are being reduced under the cover of a colorable emergency or a fake emergency proclaimed under Article 360. So you want to keep the judges in line, declare an emergency under Article 360, and then start reducing their salaries because you have that power. Also, I believe if a case ever goes to the Supreme Court where an economic emergency proclamation is questioned, I believe the court shouldn't hear that case because the court is not an expert on economics. The court can't decide this case. The court can't understand economics. Article 356 is different. You still have the device of judicial review, some sort of standard of review available. How do you decide whether there's a recession or not? Like you said, only the economists can. So those questions the court should leave for the politics. But in the one instance where you have salaries being reduced, there the court can exercise some kind of judicial review because we have already a rich jurisprudence creating adequate judicially manageable standards, talking about when independence is harmed or not. Right, that's it, I believe. Then have a good day then. Thank you.